Meanwhile, Russia is looking for more business with Africa during the second Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg, which kicks off on Thursday. Now, globally, many nations have broken ties with Moscow due to the conflict in Ukraine, but much of Africa has stayed neutral. Well, since exiting the Black Sea grain deal earlier this month, Russia has been looking for alternative ways to keep grain supplies flowing to countries who are facing food shortages. Here's Isabel Nakiria with more from Moscow.
Russia hopes to ship its food and fertilizer products to Africa by strengthening its cooperation with the continent. The second Russia-Africa summit is expected to discuss ways and means of how Moscow can push bigger volumes of exports to Africa. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Africa will not go hungry and commits to sending food both on a commercial and free of charge basis.
The volume of grain that the poorest countries received, and I repeat, this is a little over 3%, we will be ready to deliver to the poorest countries free of charge.
But researchers argue that Africa needs to become more food secure.
Not regard that free of charge supplies of grain and fertilizers can improve both economies, the national economy of Russian Federation and African, of any African country, because we know quite well that the just presents which are given, they usually deteriorate the situation with the national economy.
Global food prices have escalated due to the conflict in Ukraine. The collapse of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which allowed Ukraine grain to be exported out, has worsened the situation.
With a bumper harvest expected this year, Russia says it's able to replace all the grain coming from Ukraine, but it accuses the West of limiting its capacity to supply the poorer nations by not meeting its demands.
Russia says restrictions have made it harder for its traders to process Russian payments or obtain vessels and insurance. But the summit brings hope with support from African leaders to ease existing tensions.
The new possibilities for Russia to break the situation concerning the sanctions, and grain is a very important item which can be included into this new agreements.
The UN World Food Programme warns millions are going hungry in the Horn of Africa. But experts argue that Africa should be able to strengthen its food systems and stop relying on relief support.
65% of our land is arable. Our farmers are able to produce what is required, what we are importing. We have enormous substitutes for those products we import from the rest of the world, but we've been frustrating our smallholder farmers in terms of the market access, in terms of market access requirement, in terms of not providing the right inputs, including seeds and fertilizers.
The summit at St. Petersburg could be an opportunity for trade to grow between Africa and Russia. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Moscow.
Well, let's now discuss the expectations for that summit further with Dr. Israel Nyaderi, a lecturer of international relations at Kenya's Egerton University, who joins us now from St. Petersburg. Great to have you on the show with us, Doctor. Now, of course, this summit has been touted as a decisive moment for both Africa and Russia in their relationship going forward. What are the key areas of discussion expected to feature prominently at the talks this time around?
Well, thank you very much. Now, this particular meeting is very important because it's the first meeting that is happening between Russia and Africa after 2019. And the period we are talking about between 2019 and 2023 has been characterized by significant changes especially domestically in Russia and also internationally. In Russia, we know that the crisis with Ukraine has had a significant impact on the country. Globally, we have had to endure with the COVID-19 pandemic, but also more importantly in Africa, we have seen the continent attracting both traditional partners such as the United States and the European Union who have been seeking to revive their relationships, as well as other emerging powers such as Iran, India, and South Korea, which are equally competing to gain a foothold in the continent. So this meeting is happening at a time when a lot of things are going on concurrently. And so part of the discussion will include, among other things, how Russia can be able to strengthen its relationship with the continent, how the continent is likely to benefit from the relationship with Russia, and of course, how the two entities can build on what was agreed upon in 2019 going forward.
Well, Doctor, before we get into the history of that relationship, we know Russia did withdraw from the Black Sea grain deal, and that can now cause food shortages and also price hikes here in Africa. Will the summit, or do you expect to see the summit addressing this particular issue?
Yes, my expectation is that the African leaders will use their collective capacity in terms of their numbers to leverage Moscow to find a lasting solution to the grain crisis. Whether Russia will be able to reaffirm the supply or unrestricted supply of grain to the continent is something that I hope the leaders from Africa will be seeking to get clarification from the Russian government. So I think the grain issue will be a priority topic in the meeting, but of course that may be followed up with the situation in Ukraine, given that the African leaders have already shown interest in mediating peace between the warring parties.
That is interesting, but I'm curious to know, as we watch leaders discuss issues around security as well, do you think that the mercenary group Wagner and of course its operations on the African continent will feature at all in those discussions?
Well, the presence of the Wagner group in the continent has attracted a lot of media attention, yet this is not the first mercenary group to operate in the continent. The continent has been home to a number of regional as well as international mercenary groups. So in my opinion, I think most African countries have experience working and dealing with private military companies. But of course, the case of the Wagner group is the incursion that occurred in Moscow, which of course raised serious concerns about whether the group's conduct in Russia could spill into the continent. I don't personally think that the grievances of the Wagner group in Russia has anything to do with the activities in the African continent, and therefore I don't think that they will give the issue of the Wagner group very serious attention, given that the decision to seek or to privatize security services is often an individual country's decision. But more importantly, as Niccolo Machiavelli says in the book The Prince, relying on mercenaries is not always a good idea. So it's upon the individual African countries to assess whether the Wagner group is still relevant in their countries and make the decision individually.
An interesting take there, Doctor. But very quickly, let's go back to the Africa-Russia relationship. Now, President Putin's promise to double Russia's trade with Africa at the 2019 Russia-Africa summit, we've not seen much from that. It has not borne much fruit. So can African leaders expect anything much different this time around?
Yes, you're right that the promise to increase trade relations in 2019 has not seen any significant improvement. Nonetheless, it's important to note that the challenges and constraints of trade between Russia and Africa between 2019 and 2023 have not solely been an issue that emanates from either Africa or Russia, but other global trends and dynamics such as the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the Ukraine conflict that has led to sanctions, among other things, could have undermined and created constraints in increasing the trade relations. But I expect the leaders will be, again, relooking at gaps that can be exploited, as well as look at other means through which they can be able to build a resilient relationship going forward.